Earlier this week, we told you that the state of Washington is considering adding an additional tax to fuel that they send out of state to places like Idaho, Oregon, and Alaska. Now, Idaho, which has no oil refineries in the state, relies on places like Washington and Utah for the gas to fill all of our tanks. So some, including the governors of all three states I just mentioned, Oregon, Idaho, Alaska, they see this new tax as a way of taking advantage of a situation. I spoke with Governor Brad Little and other state house leaders this week about the situation they find themselves in and what actions they're prepared to take. There's growing frustration at the Idaho State House over a piece of legislation. Nothing new on that front. But this time, the legislation isn't from Idaho. It's from the state of Washington's legislature. A transportation and infrastructure package there includes a new 6-cent tax on fuel sent out of Washington to places like Idaho, Oregon, and Alaska.
Well, they had a little incident in Boston Harbor over tea about this about 250 years ago.
Idaho Governor Brad Little and other state leaders say the concept from the Washington legislature would essentially mean states like Idaho would be paying the bill for Washington's infrastructure package. Little and the Idaho Attorney General say they have legal concerns.
I don't think it's constitutional. I mean, the whole concept of our system is that you can't tax some other state. It's a violation of the Commerce Clause. There's all kinds of things. The easiest thing is they just not do it.
Governor Little and Attorney General Lawrence Wasden sent this letter to Washington Governor Jay Inslee asking him to stop the added fuel tax on Idahoans. The letter asks Inslee to consider how the 6% tax would impact Idahoans already struggling with inflation and rising fuel costs. They write, quote, "If these proposals reach your desk, we ask you to veto them. Now is not the time for our states to turn on each other with excise tax proposals that dampen our economy and increase costs for everyone."
States can't treat states this way, and for good reason. We have the Commerce Clause in our Constitution.
House Speaker Republican Scott Bedke and members of the Idaho House are also pushing back on the legislation. They drafted this House Joint Memorial, which is essentially a message to Washington lawmakers, asking them to consider the great relationships in business and commerce between Idaho and Washington as they consider a fuel tax on Idahoans.
I understand the principle. You know, if you have a neighbor in a position where you can extort money, yeah, maybe. But neighbors don't do neighbors that way. We're alarmed. We don't think that friends and neighboring states should do each other this way, and we're looking at all of our options.
One of those options is to take this issue to a court of law. That can only happen if the legislation passes in Washington and Governor Inslee there signs it. If that does happen, Governor Little is confident that a court would side with Idaho.
I think they got bad legal advice. I think that's part of it. I think somebody told them they could do this, and you know, it's early, and we don't have any damages because they haven't implemented yet. But as soon as they do, we'll file suit. But if I need to, I'll call Governor Inslee.
Little adds that the Commerce Clause in the United States Constitution was specifically written for moments like these.
The reason the Articles of Confederation failed and we wrote the Constitution was because the 13 states were all acting totally independently in issues of commerce. And that's the foundation of our country, is that the United States of America, that the states only have jurisdiction in their states and not outside of their states.
So here on Fridays on the 208, we tell you what happened to the stories we told you about earlier in the week. So here's what you need to know. Late Tuesday afternoon, the Washington House of Transportation Committee met to vote on the bill. Republican Representative Andrew Barkis of Olympia voted to introduce an amendment to the bill that would have taken out that 6-cent tax and replaced it with the tax on the sale of new and used cars in Washington state. He said it would have generated about $500 million a year. He, along with several other Washington lawmakers, said that this was a way to get that funding without damaging any commerce relationships with Idaho, Oregon, and Alaska.
This amendment, if adopted today, will send a signal to our neighboring states of Oregon, Alaska, and Idaho that we do not intend to start a trade war. We do not intend to afflict taxation without representation.
I don't want to be viewed by our neighbors to the north, south, and east as turning our back on regional cooperation.
This relationship that we're damaging with our friends across the various borders is really problematic.
A lot of great points, but none of them would end up mattering. The proposed amendment failed on a 14-15 vote. 2 other amendments were adopted this week that would delay that tax increase to Idaho, Oregon, and Alaska. It would delay it till the summer of 2023. Then today, the bill moved to the Rules Review Committee to work out any potential issues. After that, it could head to the House floor, has already cleared the Senate there.